for being here. I hope that everybody has received a copy of an anti-suffrage leaflet. If you haven't, and you want to see one, there are more outside, so you can look at them on your way out. There will be a reception after this event, some nibbles and refreshments and so on, so you can always look at the leaflets while you enjoy those. Okay, welcome to the Alden series. We organized this series to celebrate SUNY Oneonta faculty who have published books. And this is the ninth lecture in this series. Doesn't seem like that long ago, but it is. And I would just very briefly like to thank my fellow organizers on the Alden Series Committee, the library for funding this event, and especially Dan Birnbaum from the Damascene Bookseller to be here tonight to sell copies of Dr. Goodier's book. So if you're interested in the topic of tonight's talk and you would like to acquire a copy of her book, please go over to the desk on the right to do so. Okay. Two things. One is about if you have been bribed. I know that nobody here has been bribed, but if you have been bribed by your professor with extra credit, you can sign up for that at the end of the talk. We have sign-up sheets at the back of the room. Or if you're here also to obtain lead credit, can I direct you to the back of the room? Could you stand up maybe? Okay. Jody is going to help you with that also at the end of the talk. And if you have any questions, just come to me and I will help you. Okay. There is no food or drink allowed in this room because it is an archival special collections environment. Thank you for helping us with keeping it that way. Okay, I'm going to introduce our speaker. My colleague in the history department, Dr. Susan Goodier, completed her graduate work at SUNY at Albany. And before joining SUNY Oneonta, she taught courses at the SUNY Polytechnic Institute at Utica. Dr. Goodier's work looks at US women's activism from the Civil War to the First World War. She is the author of a number of related chapters and articles, including Politicizing the Anti-Suffragist in New York State Archives magazine, and What Price Pacifism? Rebecca Shelley and Her Struggle to Regain US Citizenship, which was published in Michigan Historical Review. She's also a public scholar for the New York Council for the Humanities and the coordinator for the Upstate New York Women's History Organization, plus a whole number of other projects, which I wanted to enumerate, but we don't have enough time. Dr. Goodier's current project focuses on the New York State woman suffrage movement, with publication expected in 2017, just in time, as she says, to celebrate the centennial of women voting in New York State. Her first book, No Votes for Women, the New York State Anti-Suffrage Movement, which was published in 2013, is the subject of this talk. And I'd just like to thank Dr. Goodier for being here tonight to talk to us about the anti-suffrage, sorry, I have the flu, so I can't talk tonight, the anti-suffrage movement in New York State. Thank you so much.
So, some of you who've heard me talk about this a little bit will be aware that suffrage, women getting the right to vote, is a big topic right now in New York State because in 2017 we celebrate 100 years of women having the right to vote. A very, very important celebration. Once women got the right to vote in New York State, the activism of and everybody's attention, all the suffragists' attention, was directed towards a federal amendment. New York State was the last state to enfranchise women by referendum, by a vote of the people, meaning the men that could vote. It was the last state to do so. And in 2020, we will celebrate 100 years that women have the right to vote all over the United States. So for you, 100 years is a long, long time. But in the scheme of things, is a very short amount of time. You women that are here have only had that right for a very, very short time, relatively speaking. So anyway, you're going to hear a lot of that kind of thing around you. But my work started when I was an undergraduate. And I want to talk a little bit about why I chose my topic. When I was an undergraduate, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah? I had no idea, and I thought at one point that maybe I would do something with textile conservation. I would take care of those old fabrics, those old embroideries and laces and so on. And so I looked at programs for a master's degree and found out I had to take a couple semesters of chemistry, so I did that. And then I did an internship. And I did the internship at this place. I went to Casanova as an undergraduate. And this is Lorenzo. It's a house that became part of the New York State Trust in 1968. And when New York State got this, what they got was a house that had been lived in continuously since about 1807 or 1809, around in there. So it was my job on my internship to find all the textiles, different kinds of embroidery and pillows and coverlets and things like that, and to bring them into this room and to preserve them, roll them up in cloth and label them. So that was what I had to do. And so in that process of doing that, I went in all the nooks and crannies of this big old house where people had not really gone before to look for anything. And I looked in this one room that was in the far back corner of the house. I don't know what the room was originally. It was like a little storage room. It had a little pointed ceiling. I could barely stand up straight. And there was shelves, and they were messy. I mean, nobody had really cleaned it since before 1968. Who knows? And there was a stack of magazines. And, of course, me, I have to be a snoop. I looked over it and I said, what's this? And it was The Woman Patriot. Oh, okay. Against suffrage, against feminism, against Mormonism. I said, what in the world is this? So what I did was I changed what I wanted to do, made a decision by the time I did my senior thesis and decided that I wanted to go into history. And when I got to graduate school, I began to explore that question. So what we're listening to tonight is kind of answering that question. How could women be opposed to getting the right to vote? How could that be? So, this is an image that was published by Currier and Ives in about 1869. Now, I tried to make this as big as I could so that you could actually see what's here, but I'll point out some of the things. If you notice, the woman is smoking. So remember, this is 1869. The woman is smoking. Of course, her hair is really exaggerated. This one doesn't even have covering on her bottom of her legs, which would have been terribly inappropriate at that time. It says, vote for the celebrated man-tamer, Susan Sharptongue. This is the ballot box. And a little bit over here, you'll also notice, and these are some of the themes that will come up again. You'll see this woman here shaking her fist at her husband who's holding the child, which would have again been very shocking for people. People would not have done that. And he's holding the baby, and you see by his knees that he's just quivering there because she's just raising her fist. And what this is it's labeled the Age of Brass, or the triumphs of women's rights. So back in the 1800s, back in the 1700s, back in the 1600s, back all these hundreds of years, people believed that if women got the right to vote or got more rights, that it would completely disrupt society. It would mess with the gender roles. It would alter the relationship of people to the government in such ways that it would ultimately destroy the state. As amazing as that is to get our heads around, that's what people believed. And so this is what people were up against. What women who wanted the right to vote, and in New York State, we usually count it from the 1840s. 1846 in Jefferson County, there was a petition asking for the right to vote. In 1848, there was a convention held in Seneca Falls, and one of the requests was for the right to vote. There were many others. Women didn't have, at that time, until the 1840s, after the 1840s, women in New York State didn't have the rights to their own children. They didn't have the rights to their own property. They didn't have the rights to their own earnings. There were many other rights that women didn't have. But the most radical of those requests for rights was the right to vote. So, women who wanted the right to vote began agitating, began petitioning, began writing documents, issuing documents like what you see in front of you, but saying that they wanted the right to vote. And this was happening, and it continued happening for a few decades. And then, in New York State, it was time to consider the Constitution. Now, the Constitution of New York State originally did not have anything about women in it. Nothing. And in 1865 or so, they decided that they would put women in there. In other words, or not put women in there, exclude them completely, by saying that the person who had the right to vote was a citizen, and that citizen was defined as male. This is connected with the Reconstruction Amendment, so they got the big idea that they were going to put it in there that it was only a male that could vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a very prominent suffragist and women's rights activist, had said, if they put the word male in that, and she meant the federal Constitution, but if they put the word male in that Constitution, it's going to take us 100 years to get it back out again. And she wasn't too far off. It took 69 years in New York State. It took 72 years in the United States to get that word male out of the Constitution. So in 1893, it began. There was some buzz about it's time to get that word male out of the Constitution. Now, they were going to hold a constitutional convention, which means that all the legislators get together and they figure out what's going to happen with the Constitution. They were really thinking about reapportionment. They were actually thinking about which part should be this region and what population lines and how to draw those regions. But they were also thinking about maybe taking that word male out of the Constitution. So suffragists were canvassing the entire state. Susan B. Anthony, for example, and most of you have heard of her. She was from Rochester. She was very, very, very prominent in the suffrage movement in New York State, but also nationally. She went to probably every single county in the state, and we have 58 or so counties. And she gave talk after talk after talk after talk, as did Matilda Jocelyn Gage, as did suffragist after suffragist after suffragist. That's how they were trying to drum up interest in getting that word male out of the Constitution. At one place, Susan B. Anthony said, was giving her talk about women having the right to vote. These were very influential talks. At one place, someone in the audience said to her, "But Miss Anthony, do women want the right to vote? And she said, well, they don't oppose it. And suddenly, all along the line, all kinds of places, Albany, New York, Syracuse, Utica, all these places, women said, oh my gosh, if I don't oppose the right to vote, if I don't do something to oppose it, I'm gonna get the vote whether I like it or not. And so they drew to put together committees, small committees, and their goal was to keep the word male in the Constitution. Keep things at the status quo. Keep things the same as they had been for hundreds and hundreds of years. So some of those women, the women from New York, met at the home on Willow Street. This home still exists and is still in pretty good shape too. The home of Carolyn Haynes Putnam. She was one of those women who did not want the right to vote. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. What I want to do is I want to introduce you to a number of the women that were either at this meeting or involved in the organization. I'd like to do that, but this is where they met. Actually, I should tell you more about what their reasons were before I introduce you to the people. That makes more sense. All right, so reasons why they oppose women getting the right to vote. Does it seem crazy to us today? Do you use your right to vote? Better. I mean, it was a real struggle. But some of the reasons that they oppose getting the right to vote. For one thing, women had, for many generations, been able to change things, to work through problems by working together in their reform organizations. Women had been very involved in social work, in temperance work, in the abolition movement. They had done incredible things with their ability to organize, with their ability to, and slowly, but to petition, sometimes, rarely, but until the suffragists came along and did more of it, to speak. But they had already been doing a lot of activism. And so for anti-suffragists, for women who opposed getting the right to vote, they said, what do we need the vote for? We can change things without it. We have been very, very effective without it. That's one reason. Another reason that women oppose the right to vote, and reasons change over time, but I'll just give you some of those highlights. Many people said that and this is probably the most challenging to wrap our heads around, is the idea that the vote is quintessentially male. And that therefore it should be men who vote. That a male head of household, which in the so-called ideal family, there's a male head of household, he can take care of the needs of the family. And so we only need one voter. If there's two voters, what if they disagree with each other? It might form dissension between the two. Or the vote would cancel each other out. What's the point? Others said that the way to back up, you can vote, but in order to back up that vote, you need a bullet. In other words, you need to be able to defend the country if you're going to vote and make decisions for it. So, if there's a ballot, there should be a bullet. They'd use the words in different ways to make their statements. Eventually, there were anti-suffragists who opposed immigrant women who didn't necessarily know English having the right to vote, women who opposed people of color getting the right to vote, and so they were willing to say, well, it's okay if I don't have the right to vote as long as all those other people don't get the right to vote. So there's a wide variety of reasons, and as I said, they change over time, and eventually it gets to the point where the idea is that it should be a state's decision, not a federal decision, and so any of the suffragists who were working on a federal amendment were opposed by people who said it should be a state decision. So these women said, we need to get together, we need to organize ourselves so that we are not enfranchised or that we don't have the right to vote against our will. So what did they do? They talked to other people, they gathered at places and they advertised that there was going to be a meeting to oppose enfranchisement. They petitioned, they got a lot of signatures, and then they actually went to the Constitutional Convention that summer of 1894, and they presented their arguments via a man. They had a man speak for them. The suffragists presented their arguments, but they presented them themselves. And that's another thing, I kind of interrupted myself just a little bit to say, what's interesting is that the suffragists very often have figured it out first, how to do these political actions, to petition, to just make speeches, to lobby, to write letters and things. And anti-suffragists came along a little bit later, but then they would do many of those same things. And that activism, those actions increase over time till the time you get to the 19 teens, for example. It's everywhere. It's just you can't turn around without seeing suffrage or anti-suffrage somewhere. So, excuse me for just a second. So I want to introduce you to some of the women. Now, it was challenging, very challenging, to do research on anti-suffragists in New York State. For one thing, almost none of them left papers. In effect, they were the losers. And a lot of the losing sides, a lot of the losing groups, throw them away. Maybe they're embarrassed, maybe they're uncomfortable, but there are very few collections of papers. The house that I showed you, Lorenzo, has, surprisingly, and I don't think most people know this because they haven't digitized anything, but they have the most outstanding, true collection of papers on anti-suffrage that I have ever seen. Because two of the people who lived in that house were anti-suffragists. And they kept everything is intact from 1809 or whatever the date. The library has virtually every anti-suffrage book that was ever published. There are 4 or 5 scrapbooks filled with newspaper articles, all glued in very, very carefully, all kinds of papers, all kinds of information. In fact, even as I was working on my book, one of the people from there called me and said, we just found a whole nother pile of papers, and do you want to come see them? I'm like, yeah, I do. And so it's very hard to get at them. So there's now that more and more things are being digitized, and almost daily, because if I go back and look at some of these people, I'm seeing new things that are being published online. So that's how I had to get at a lot of them. And I'll show you when I come across someone who does have papers, because there are a couple of people. But I also want to show you these women because I want you to get an idea of who would oppose getting the right to vote. What kind of women were they? Were they stay-at-home mothers? Were they, or what? Now, Abby Hamlin Abbott had 6 children. She was married to a man, Lyman Abbott, who was a journalist. She, too, was a journalist. The Ladies' Home Journal ran a column by her for many, 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 many years. People loved her. They thought she was terrific. And they were advice columns. She did another column in an earlier paper. And so she was very involved in this kind of ladies' journalism. And we'll see that quite a bit. She's credited with converting her husband, who was published a popular magazine of the time called The Outlook. And he was thinking that, women's suffrage probably is a good idea. I think that'll be great. And she says, no, it's not a good idea, and dissuaded him from his original support of women getting the right to vote. Richard Watson and Helen Decay Gilder were both anti-suffragists. If you lived in New York and you were somebody, you went to their house on Friday evenings. They had parties, and there were like gatherings of the intellectuals, the artists, the creative people, and you'd go to their home and you would have food to eat, conversations. They were probably the least wealthy of all of the groups. And what happened between the time that I had finished the first manuscript and before I finished revising the manuscript, these papers became available, and I was able to get a grant. They're out in Bloomington, at the Lilly Library out in Bloomington. And they had purchased them. I thought that was kind of weird. But there were quite a few papers out there, and I could look at old calendars where she had written, I have an anti-suffrage meeting, and the place it was held, and that it was held by Lucy Scott. And so it gave me a lot more of the specific kind of information. She was never real prominent in the movement, but they were prominent people. So what they said was important, and people listened to them. So it was a collection of papers. It did take me a long time to get through them. It was very exciting for me to be able to see them. Now, and I also got to look in her diaries, and she had little tiny pocket diaries. They're only, this big, and she'd slip them into her pocket and she'd write things. She was an artist, and quite an artist of note. It took 2 years for Richard to talk her into marrying him because she didn't like that housewife thing at all. Interesting, huh? Finally, he persuaded her to marry him. And it was like she dropped almost everything other than being a wife and being a mother. But she didn't like it, and the reason that I know is in some of these little diaries, she started writing things like, I don't feel well, I'm sick, I'm ill, angry at Richard. Turns out, it took me a while to figure it out, you just have a couple of clues here and there because people they weren't as outspoken as they are today. Turns out she was pregnant for her 5th child. And she was furious at her husband, furious at him. And it was very clear as she was writing that that's how she felt. And she basically dropped all of her own artwork at that point. But she's one of the founders of the Art Students League. And interesting, there's a whole other story about art. But interestingly, in the Art Students League, both men and women were treated equally. And that was one of the points that she was involved, one of the decisions she was involved in making. And that picture is of the Art Students League. This is Helen Kendrick Johnson. She was, her father was a professor in Rochester. She was raised mostly in Clinton, New York, not very far away from here. And she was also a journalist. She took over for a while a magazine called The American Magazine. And it was right around the time, 1893 or so, when people were saying, what is this women's suffrage thing? What's this all about? And she decided that she would look into that. And so she ended up writing a book, a full hardcover, complete book on arguments for and against women's suffrage. And of course, she herself was opposed. And that's the weight of the book is about that. She was married to Rossiter Johnson, her husband, who continued with the anti-suffrage movement for years, even after the death of after his wife died. She died in 1915, and so she didn't see it all the way through. Another interesting story is about Annie Nathan Meyer. Annie Nathan Meyer is this woman here. She's one of the founders of Barnard College, which is in New York, and of course was originally founded as a women's college because Columbia wouldn't let women into their classrooms. So she founded a women's college, and she rode her bicycle from place to place trying to get enough money and enough support to found that college. She is one of a few Jewish women that were involved in the movement. Her sister, Maud Nathan, she opposed women getting the right to vote. See how complicated it gets? Her sister, who was about 5 years older than she, is Maud Nathan. And Maud Nathan was a prominent suffragist. She was also involved with the Consumers League. She was very concerned about that working girls were treated well, and so was involved in a lot of activism. And suffragists delighted in inviting Annie Nathan Meyer because they were sisters. They didn't agree on this. This was an issue. Some people say it was because, oh, Annie was jealous of her older sister. But this is the kind of thing you'd find, is that families, even people within families, would sometimes be in opposition to each other. This is Alice Foote McDougall. She was a coffee broker. She was a millionaire. Her husband was out of the picture. He had died. And she raised her children alone, but she did it by being a coffee broker, by buying and selling coffee. And she had a little shop in Grand Central Station where she'd sell coffee. But then she would have little anti-suffrage meetings. And she did not agree that women should have the right to vote. They didn't need to vote. And so she didn't do a lot of writing. She wasn't particularly active in the anti-suffrage movement. But she was opposed to women getting the right to vote. The only woman I found who converted from anti-suffrage to suffrage was Mrs. Julian Heath. And it took me like 5 years or 8 years to finally find her first name. And I don't remember what it is. I couldn't find it again. But she always, always went by Mrs. Julian Heath. Even her obituary is Mrs. Julian Heath, which I think is, that's a little unusual. She was the head of the Housewives League, and that was a national organization. But she realized after years of working that women needed the vote in order to change things. And of course, suffragists delighted in the fact that she had switched sides. But she's really the only one that I found of the women that I looked at in New York. And I tried to look as hard as I could at everyone. The first president of the anti-suffrage, the New York State Anti-Suffrage Organization was Josephine Jewel Dodge. She had 5 children. One of those died, and her husband died in the early 1890s. So she was a widow, but she was extremely wealthy. And she was very, very active in a number of areas, including the day nursery movement, which was a way of, well, what they did was they created nurseries and had daycare for children, especially of working class. She also did for children of color. There was another nursery that she founded. And so she was very involved, even nationally known for her work in the day nursery project. But she was very opposed to women getting the right to vote. She felt that it was not necessary, that women did their work best without being like men. She was bird-like. She was small, very small, and bird-like. And one day, there was these first years, there was a gathering at one hotel and then a gathering at one at the Waldorf and one at the Shirley. The Waldorf is where the anti-suffragists were, and the Shirley or another hotel. And she walked right up and she just marched her way up to the front and she said, and if you believe this hocus pocus, I feel sorry for you. But if you want to listen to the real ideas and the ideas of the anti-suffragists, come on with me. We're having a meeting over at the Waldorf. Marched right in. And there were those kinds of confrontations between suffragists and anti-suffragists because they knew each other. They were in the same reform groups. They were involved in many of the same projects, the same kind of activism. They were of the same socioeconomic level. So they did know each other. And I'll come back to that again. The woman who was president for the longest time of the New York State anti-suffrage organization is a woman, Alice Hill Chittenden. Now, her grandfather was a Republican. He had served one term as the representative in the House of Representatives from New York, and she had been educated. She had a partial college education. Kind of a college education at Miss Proctor's School in Connecticut, and had gone actually with some very prominent women who became activists. But she always disagreed with having the right to vote. In fact, got involved with the movement by the time she was 25 years old. So she was president and she was the most dynamic of all of the women who were president. She was president from January of 1913 until women got the right to vote in New York State in November of 1917. And so very, very prominent in the movement. I will tell you something else about her in a little bit. This is the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. Both organizations, and in fact, virtually all the leadership of the anti-suffrage movement, of the national, were also from New York. All the leadership nationally came from New York. It's really interesting when you think that New York is often touted as the cradle of the birth of the suffrage movement, and yet all of its leadership also came from the state. There's a few other vice presidents and different people like that come from other states, like Illinois or something, but most of them came from New York. So for a long time, this National Association was also headquartered in New York. So what kinds of things did suffragists do? And anti-suffragists do? And some of them are, they did many of the same things that suffragists did. One of their projects was to try to connect with working class women. And this is an example of this. This is a number of anti-suffrage women. They're standing on the dock just in front of where the barge, a big barge called the Starina. This was in 1913. And what it was that on Decoration Day, which we call Memorial Day now, but on Decoration Day, they had a plan that for 50 cents or something, that working class girls could go for a trip up the Hudson River on that barge. And so it was a big party. It was like 1,000 people did this, and they had their boyfriends, their men friends, with them. And the suffragists wanted to get involved in this, and they said, no suffrage or anti-suffrage at all, period. It's just going to be a day for the working class, young working class men and women. And but they said that they were going to do this as an annual thing, but instead they only did it 1 year, and it's probably because they saw the girls sitting on the boys' laps and they were dancing the turkey trot. So they only did it once. Never again. They also went to state fairs. This is not a good picture, but it's very hard to find images of things that they did. But this is an image this is the New York State Association, and this is this comes from Lorenzo. The New York State Association opposed to women's suffrage. This is also 1913. This is Alice Hill Chittenden here. She's probably tired because she doesn't have a very happy face. seek not, and it's interesting, they say, seek not thy fellow citizen to guide, till thou canst order well thy home. One of the other arguments of the anti-suffragists was that women needed to take care of their own homes, keep the home fires burning in order to before they're ready to go into politics, which was a dirty, nasty, challenging kind of place. They also one day rented a plane, and the pilot, or someone who's riding with the pilot, this is in the early days of aviation, threw pink pamphlets out that said, no votes for women, don't vote for women. This was in one of the small towns in Skaneateles in 1915. And this made the Syracuse newspapers because there was this booth that says vote no, this is the home, heaven, and mother party. And this was on one side of Genesee Street. And on the other side of Genesee Street is the suffragists. And one of the suffragists went over to one of these pillars here, one of these posts here, and she pulled down one of the papers, just like what you have, perhaps, and was reading it. And when she finished reading it, she put it up. But it got around that she was tearing apart the anti-suffrage booth. And so for 3 or 4 days, it was all crazy, and people were, they were tearing down our things. And the newspaper concludes with, after this is all over, well, it's all settled down now, and they're going back to being friends again. And that's another thing to try to understand, is that they're interwoven, that these connections, this isn't one against the other, they're interconnected and interrelated. So there's those kinds of things happen. Well, New York, another fun thing or interesting thing that they did was suffragists did parades. Anti-suffragists, I found only 1 or 2 that got involved in parades. Because what's happening now that we're at 1915 is that war in Europe has happened. So World War I has started. And the Europeans are at war. The United States isn't. But there are people who are parading, marching for war preparedness, that the United States, encouraging the United States to get involved, thinking that this is absolutely necessary. And so that kind of thing kind of gets woven in through here. But the anti-suffragists figured it out. They weren't going to parade. This is a suffrage, this is one of the parades that was taking place. And what you can't see, but trust me on this, is that this is a sign up over one of the buildings that says anti-suffrage. And so they had, all these people are walking out under the anti-suffrage sign. They also set up a first aid station right there. And they were equipped with nurses and people who were ready to, if somebody fainted or somebody got hurt. I guess the only thing that day, medically, that they had to treat was a dog that got its foot stepped on or something like that. But they were prepared. Let me go back. So, in New York, women get the right to vote by referendum. What that means is that on the ballot, you choose who you want to vote for, but then there's also a space, women get the right to vote yes or no. And so people would check yes or no. So there was actually two of these, one in 1915 and one in 1917. And in 1915, the voters decided that women shouldn't get the right to vote. In 1917, there's almost a complete switch in the numbers. The amount of people who had voted against women getting the right to vote in New York State, the amount of men that had voted against, it flip-flopped. And they were now those who supported women getting the right to vote. And so women got the right to vote in November of 1917. So the antis had lost. Well, another question that I asked myself is, what happens Do these people just poof, disappear? What do they do? Now they lost all this work that they had been doing for years and years and years. Well, what they did was they also turned their attention to the national movement. And the national movement, Mrs. Dodge, Josephine Jewel Dodge, stepped down. And in her place was Alice Hay Wadsworth. Now, her husband, James Wolcott Wadsworth, was the senator from New York State, from Geneseo. And he's out there. She, from there, so he's in Washington. So she goes to Washington. She takes over the anti-suffrage movement in Washington, D.C., the national level movement. But the whole tone changes. It's not fun anymore. It's not funny anymore. She's very serious. She really hates the leader of the suffragists, Carrie Chapman Catt. She's bitter, and I don't get it. He is one of the most bitter people. He wasn't very good about being in Congress when he was supposed to be. There were people who commented on that. But he was opposed to women getting the right to vote. Even though his state had voted for it, he continued to oppose it. Even though his constituency had supported it, he opposed it. So the tone changes, and the anti-suffragists at the national level become really pretty nasty. A year later, she steps down. Another woman, Mary Kilbreth, steps up. And man, she is really bitter and angry. They become part of a congressional watchdog type group, and they watch everything that Congress is doing. And this is the time of the first Red Scare, anybody who seems a little bit like the socialists, go right on them just like that. And they're going to name the names, and they're going to tell everybody what these people in Congress were doing. And they say this. So everything changes. The tone changes. The attitude changes. The leadership changes. Still from New York, but very, very different kind of movement. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of those women in just a second. I wanted to show you a couple of other, some cartoons. I love cartoons. This one is about, these are the men, they're drinking, smoking cigars. Well, we saved the home. In other words, in 1915, women didn't get the right to vote. This is another one that shows how the father bird says, well, Ma, why, Ma? These eggs will get all cold. And she who's a suffragist feminist, that's her ideal, is no, you set them on yourself, old man. My country needs me. So there's lots of them like this. This is a kind of, you can see the influence of the war. And if you can't read what this says, it's feminist Mormons, because they can have more than one wife, and socialists. All of those are suffragists. So if you don't fight against them, you're fighting for them. And interestingly, most suffragists were very divided on the war. Some supported it, some opposed it, some decided to just stay out of it, stay neutral. All but Annie Nathan Meyer of the anti-suffragists supported the war effort. They supported preparedness and getting involved in the war effort. And Annie Nathan Meyer was very conflicted about it. She didn't outright oppose it, but what she did was she worked at something else. So she made a movie called Out of the Garbage Pail, which is about how you can save all those scraps and do something with those scraps. And of course, these are suffragists, and this is the way that they're trying to get their right to vote, is by shaking their fist at President Wilson. Now, that house that I showed you, that very, very first house that I showed you, Lorenzo, this is the woman who owned that house. This is Helen Crumbar Fairchild. And she started an organization called the Woman Voters Anti-Suffrage Party. Right? Because they have the right to vote. But it's an anti-suffrage party. And what they did was they required all of their members to vote. Vote out any members of Congress who had voted for women to have the right to vote. And so this was their political party. This is a copy of one of the petitions that they had. She was president of that organization, 1819, and it only goes on to about 1919. So it doesn't last very long. Her husband was a lawyer, and they lived between Cazenovia and New York City. He actually was one of the people who once women had the right to vote, took it to court. They took it all the way to the Supreme Court and said that it was unconstitutional. They decided, the justices in the Supreme Court decided that they weren't going to deal with that at all. They just kind of threw out the case. But they did talk about it, and there is some information about that. But meanwhile, this is about ratification. Just the last couple of buttons. It needed 3 more states to ratify, and women get the right to vote by 1 vote in Tennessee, which was the 36th state to ratify. As I said, in the meantime, the anti-suffragists are very concerned about how government is getting into everything, and that octopus of government that gets into your home and into all kinds of your business, including your family, because women have the right to vote. But nevertheless, women have the right to vote. And this illustrates how hard it was for women to break into the political parties, so represented by the Republicans, represented by the elephant, the donkey represents the Democrats, and the woman in the middle, that although she's a voter, she doesn't have any rights in the parties. She doesn't have any position, any power within the parties. And so many of these suffragists formed like the Republican Women's Club, for example. And one of those organizations was, and Democratic clubs. And so what they were doing was they were trying to support either the Democratic or the major parties, right? But they did find it extremely difficult. Alice Hill Chittenden, you remember I talked about her, that was president of the anti-suffrage in New York State for 5 years? She became president of the National Republican Women's Club within 10 years. And what she and many other anti-suffragists got involved in is educating women about how to vote. And that became their focus. So what happened to women after they had the right to vote? Even though they had opposed it for years and years and years, they voted. Some of them were the first. In fact, their obituaries would say, she was an anti-suffragist, but she went and registered to vote, and she voted, often for things like temperance and things like that. But almost everyone I could find got involved, most often with the Republican Party. And that's what they did. They shifted their energy into educating women about the vote. That was the big forte. And Alice Hill Chittenden, as I said, was president of the National Women's Republican Club. And so this actually happened in about 1932. These women are all dressed up, and what they're doing is holding a mock convention and voting for president, who they're going to vote for as vice president, who they're going to vote for, choose to run as president. And so they were making a big mockery of it. And I did a lot of research on it, and all of those details are really funny. So for example, one woman who was was a makeup manufacturer, she bribed the delegates with jars of cold cream. each of the delegates had their own song, and they would, as they went up on stage, it was a whole spoof on how difficult it was for women to get into party politics. So that's that. There's lots more, but if you have questions, you're welcome to ask me, but I will stop there. So much.
I wanted to thank Dr. Goodier for this really great talk, and we do have time for questions, so yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Why do you think that most women didn't want to vote? Do you think it was like fear of, like you said at the end, like fear of it like controlling their homes, or fear of their husbands being angry about it? What do you think was the real reason? Because I still have a very hard time figuring out why they didn't want equal rights.
Right. There's such a range of reasons. There's really hundreds of reasons, and one of these gives. Did you get one of these?
I did.
Yeah, make sure that you get one of these, because that gives you some of the reasons. Most of them felt that they already had as many rights as they needed. Many did. But remember that they were of a socio-economic status that meant that they didn't understand what it was like for plain old everyday people. All right, so they were able to go to this political person or this powerful individual and say, you know, I really think such and such should change.
Okay.
So they had indirect influence and could make changes. That's one thing. The idea about it being quintessentially male, I think, is a very prominent reason. I think that's very important. Custom is another reason. That's a major, major change. For hundreds of years, women had no political rights. And they had no rights, as I said, to their children or to their earnings or to anything. So they were used to that. That was a comfortable place. As weird as it sounds to us, but that was a comfortable place. And so, and as I said before, too, that as time went on, their arguments refined, they honed them, and some of them were simply opposed to having immigrant women or people of color having the right to vote. And there's that, and there was that with the suffragists as well. So it's not just exclusively the anti-suffragists.
Yeah.
I know you're currently working on African American women and their participation in suffrage in New York State. But what role did African American women play in the New York anti-suffrage narrative? Did they play one at all?
There was two pieces of evidence that I was able to find when I was doing my research. There was an anti-suffrage group in Massachusetts, and of course I wasn't writing about Massachusetts, but they were the Back Bay antis, and they were people of, from what I understood, there were people of color. I never could find out anything more about that. I'll keep looking for the rest of my life. In New York State, there was one dissertation that was done where they looked at voting areas by district, and they did kind of a tally of who was who and where they lived and so on. And there were African American women in that study that were opposed according to the survey, but I can't find out, and I didn't go any further with it, I can't find out their names. I can't find out any more about them. So this house, you know, who was in it, and check they were anti or they were pro-suffrage. So there were many African American men who opposed African American women getting the right to vote for many of the same reasons that white men opposed women getting the right to vote, which of course they did for years and years and years. So they felt the same way, that they were the protectors, that they were in charge of the house, that they had the power, that she didn't need to do that. And as African American families were trying very hard to emulate what they saw as middle-class white families, they emulated it even in those kinds of ways as well. So African American women suffragists, one of the points that they made was, these men need to have some respect for us.
You mentioned earlier that there were examples of the anti-suffrage movement being negative towards Mormonism. Could you go into further detail about why that was?
Because Mormons had more than one wife, and there were some Mormons. I mean, in the Mormon religion, it was, at that point, was acceptable for them to have more than one wife. And many of these women, many of the anti-suffragists, and I didn't talk about this, were very religious in that they felt that that was completely at odds with their religion. But it doesn't come up a real lot other than the Mormons. They usually put them in with socialists and feminists, because they were the bad guys, so to speak.
It seems really interesting how there's all these mutual recriminations or recriminations against different groups as part of this suffrage, anti-suffrage.
How it does, it pulls in everything, and it's everywhere. The sinking of the Titanic. How does that have an anti-suffrage component? Well, it does, because and that was in April 1912. What happened was, even before it got back to the rescue ship got back into New York City, what had happened was the story had come out that there was the law of the sea. Women and children first, and women and children were the ones more heavily rescued, right? And so they got into the boats. And so anti-suffragists said, look, men are going to take care of us. We don't need the right to vote because men will take care of us. Suffragists, on the other hand, heard about the men who put on coats and dressed as if they were women and got in the boats and took the place of a woman or child. And they said, look, it's not enough. There are too many men who are going to do that kind of thing. Chivalry is dead. And so even then, there's cartoons and there's discussion between them, even about the sinking of the Titanic. You had a question?
I was just wondering if, after the fact, after women got suffrage, was there any, documents of them regretting their decision to be anti-suffrage, after they saw how far women have come?
No, that's a very interesting question, because a lot of people were very interested in this. And so in 1927, 10 years after, there were a lot of newspaper articles that focused on what about 10 years, what do you think now 10 years later? And what's really interesting to me is that most suffragists were disappointed. They felt that women hadn't done enough. They didn't see women as influencing politics as much as they thought they would. Women didn't vote as a bloc. In other words, they didn't vote as a group, and because women all think differently, right? Anti-suffragists thought that women were doing great. They said, look at how far they've come. They've really made some good progress. They're getting registered to vote. They're voting. They're voting for some of these issues. And they were thrilled with how well they've come. But they had no expectations.
Right.
Suffragists had great expectations. They thought that the vote, they could change the world with the vote. And the reality was that they couldn't change the world with the vote. But the anti-suffragists were perfectly all right with that. They thought they were doing great. Every time they got somebody to register to vote, they thought they were doing great. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah. That's why, and it was, one of the questions that I had right from the beginning was, what did they do after? And how did they feel? And did they regret it? They were perfectly happy. And one other point I'll make, and you have a question, one other point I would make is that Alice Hill Chittenden worked with suffragists. Alice Hill Chittenden was the president for 5 years of the anti-suffrage. And so about her, and she worked in a group with former suffragists as well as herself being, and everybody knew she was the president. And they worked with her. She died of cancer in 1935, I think. And the women of her organization, the National Women's Republican Club, donated a hospital room in her name because they loved her. People then, they just once it happened, they forgave each other for which side they were on, and they were in groups together, former suffragists, former anti-suffragists. So it doesn't seem to have been an issue. I don't think she regretted it. I think she always felt that I did what I felt was right
So
at the
even
time.
after the fact, she thought that she was right.
Yeah. Well, she voted.
So she
And
was yeah.
She voted.
Okay.
So she, and this is another thing that kind of is a point about, to go on with getting the right, why to oppose it. Many of these anti-suffragists felt that women weren't ready for it, and that they needed education and that they needed more time.
Okay.
And so this process, they felt that they had made it through in those years.
I just have two quick questions. First, how did the anti-suffragists feel about the prohibition movement? Because that was very much, the proponents of prohibition often said this is a way to protect women, because men, will become violent, hurt them, and it shows a lack of masculine control. If you're an anti-suffragist, how are you going to get men to support prohibition if women can't vote to impose it? I mean, how did they feel about prohibition?
Mrs. See if I can remember her name. That was the president of the. She was the president of the Anti-Suffrage organization in Syracuse, New York. Died in early 1918, and her obituary said that she had been the president of the Anti-Suffrage organization, but as soon as women got the right to vote, she went out. She must have died in 1919. She went out and registered to vote, and she voted for temperance. So she voted. She was one of the ones who did. Those that I could find evidence for, it went either way, just like men.
But if you're going to say that men, you don't need to vote because men will protect you, I'm sure will be. They're all wrong.
Yeah, but that's kind of a class difference. You weren't seeing that at the level that most of these women, the status that most of these women had. Most of them were elite, and so most of them weren't dealing with the kinds of issues that working class women were dealing with in terms of alcohol and violence in that way. And many of them, I don't know for each and every woman, because I don't necessarily have that. I couldn't find that information, but some of them supported prohibition and were involved in it. But there was one anti-suffrage woman who was in the former anti-suffragist who was in the anti-prohibition organization. And that was partly because they don't want that, that octopus thing, that idea that they don't want the government being involved in all of their personal business. And they felt that having a drink was a personal business thing.
My other quick question is, did the anti-suffragists have like a generational view of women, that their strongest opposition to women having the vote is they feel young women are, the ones that would be the most irresponsible with the vote? Or they just think all women really shouldn't?
It was more class. That it was if enfranchising women could have been for upper class women only, they probably wouldn't have opposed the right to vote. So there's a real class issue there. Yeah. Any other questions? So there's one other thing I want to say. So when I was in graduate school and I was working on this project, I had some people say, "What do you want to work on those old babies for?" And others that said, "Well, maybe you'll be identified as one of those ultra-conservative kind of people." And I thought about that a lot, and I thought, what am I going to do? I don't want to write about conservative people all the time. I don't agree with this, You don't have to identify with the people that you write about. What you have to do is you have to be able to treat them with respect. And that was my goal. And also to understand what suffragists were up against. It was very, 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 very difficult for women to get these rights. And so it's an incredible thing that we have those rights. It took generations of women working all the time. And only one person that was there in 1848 lived long enough to be able to vote. The rest of them had all died. They had lived their entire lives not reaching their goals. And sort of something that we need to honor is all that work that went before us. It's not done. There's lots more to do. But it's one of those things. It's that process. It's just, to me, it's just an amazing process. And to find out what one of the groups that these women were up against in their fight for rights and that was my angle. So anyway, thanks again so much for listening.
Yeah, I want to thank Dr. Goodier for this talk. It was such a privilege to listen to it, and we were so privileged to have you all here tonight. We know that you're very busy at this time of the semester. We would love to have a bite of food with you outside. We also have comment cards. If you could give us some feedback on the talk, that would be great. And if you have any questions for us, just let us know. And if not, we'll see you outside. Thank you.